shadow was just a K9 soldier until the day he fell from a mountain ledge and his Marine refused to let go. That moment in the Wyoming wind would unravel military lies, test a father's courage, and prove that trust can survive anything. This is the true story of a man, a dog, and a promise made on the edge of death. Like, subscribe, and follow their journey because some battles are fought with more than weapons. The wind came off the ridge like it had a mission, needling through the seams of Staff Sergeant Jack Miller's parka and hurrying the snow into ghostly sheets that crossed the Marine Corps winter training grounds in Montana. He'd run these slopes a dozen times with young handlers and green K9s in tow, teaching them how to read the mountain, how to respect ice that looked solid until it decided not to be. Tonight he was alone, checking a flagged route the storm had nearly erased an officer's quiet errand at the end of a long training day. The sky had gone the color of tarnished pewter, and the sun, such as it was, sagged behind slabs of cloud. Jack's breath rose in a white ribbon and disappeared. The radio on his chest whispered static, then silence. Range control had signed off 20 minutes earlier, reminding him that wind chill would drop hard after dark. It already had. He walked the ridgeline with the unthinking rhythm of a man who'd learned to keep moving when the air turned mean. Iron cleats bit ice. Snow squeaked. Somewhere below the river wore a crust of thin white glass. Jack paused, listening. The mountain talked if you let its small slides bark, creaks, the fine hiss of powder shifting. He heard something else, not the plain bark of a fox or the echo of a raven. A dog's sound, low and failing, a coil of hurt rolled in fur. He tilted his head, lifted his hood back, and stepped closer to the edge. "Hold on," he said aloud to no one yet. "Just hold on." He eased onto his belly and belly crawled the last few feet. The cornice had that treacherous look of snow suspended by habit. He tested with his ice axe, felt the real rock edge, and peeked over. 15 feet down, where the cliff face undercut itself, a dark shape strained against a shelf of rime and dirt. 2 forepaws were hooked on a root that stuck from the limestone like an old handhold. Rear legs kicked at emptiness, a tan and black muzzle lifted toward him. Teeth showing not in threat, but the slack grimace of a dog trying to breathe and hold on at the same time. The eyes were what caught and held him steady, wide and working. Jack's hands went cold in a way the weather hadn't yet managed. The dog wore a collar half buried in ice. He saw the dull gleam of a tag scarred and old. He saw the way the right hindquarter tucked wrong, the fur shaved unevenly by time and injury. Memory rose like a flare in fog. Syria. Sand blown in sheets metal, blistering in the sun, a walled street that turned a corner into a thunderclap. A dog dragging a handler clear, then a blast that lifted the world. After a report, tight and spare, K9 presumed KIA. Jack had read it on a cot with boots still on his feet and a taste of copper in his mouth. He blinked hard and the mountain came back. The dog below scratched, slipped, rehooked, and let out a sound so thin it cut cleaner than any shout. Jack checked anchor points by feel. A waist-thick pine stood back from the lip. He looped his rope twice around its trunk, threw 2 quick hitches, then made it a figure 8 on a steel carabiner that clicked home in a way he trusted more than most things. He tested the line with his full weight. It held. The wind shoved at his back as if impatient. "Easy," he called down. "You're not alone." He dropped a locking descender onto the rope, clipped it to his harness, and backed into space. Ice accepted his crampons with the reluctant crunch of old sugar. The world narrowed to gloved fingers, metal bite, and the dog's breath gone ragged below. He worked down past rime-choked knots in the rock until his boots were level with the dog's shoulder. Up close, the collar's tag resolved USMC K9. The stamped name had taken a beating, but it was still there beneath scratches and grit Ranger. His throat closed on the single word. Jack had said that name in another country with grit between his teeth, had shouted it down. Alleys and across blast lanes had once reached for that same rough when a mortar hissed far too close. He'd watched a handler named Ortega sleep with the dog's head on his boots, both of them on duty, even in dreams. A year later, Ortega's name went on a wall. Rangers went into a report. Buddy Jack said softly, "Because sometimes you can only say what you have." Ranger's lips twitched. The dog's eyes locked and didn't look away. Jack took one more step down, enough to reach. The root groaned with the long fatigue of winter and weight. Ranger flinched as the ice under his ribs cracked and fell like small glass. The dog's paws bled where claws had ground down to find purchase on wood. "I've got you," Jack said. He reached with his left hand, and Ranger's head jerked by reflex teeth closing around the glove. Pressure met pressure. Jack didn't pull away. He went still the way he taught young Marines to go still when a frightened K-9 forgot the difference between help and threat. Ranger's bite didn't deepen. A tremor ran through the dog's jaw. The eyes held. Jack spoke very quietly. "It's Jack Ranger." The name seemed to pass through the gale like a warm current. The pressure on his glove softened until Jack could feel the shape of each tooth through composite fabric and leather. He slid his right hand up slow as thaw and looped a short sling under Ranger's front legs, working the line against the shaking body without losing balance. His thigh muscles complained. His shoulders burned the way they had when he was 25, and sure pain was a down payment on purpose. Above the tree creaked. A gust swung him an inch too. Ice pebbles tinked down the rope and rang like small bells on his carabiner. Jack cinched the sling with a practiced tug and clipped it to his main line. He looked Ranger in the eyes and nodded once. The dog's breath came in hot bursts against the cold. He felt the rope take both their weight and leaned back, trusting knots, steel, and the stubbornness that had carried him through a dozen tight corners. "On my count," he said, "because counting makes courage into steps." 1. The root cracked louder. 2. Ranger's paws slipped an inch, then another. 3. Jack took the line in his good hand and stood against nothing, hauling himself and the dog an inch, then 2, then 6. Ranger's body came with him, the sling bearing the front, as the rear legs finally found the cruelty of the cliff face and pushed. They rose together in a series of short, brutal heaves. Ice tore at Jack's pants and kissed his knee through cloth with a sting that promised a bruise he'd feel tomorrow. The rope sang against rock. Ranger's breath was a metronome of pain and will. The last foot turned long. The lip looked suddenly farther away the way goals do just before they give. Jack's fingers numbed and then came back in sharp pins. He leaned, found the edge with his elbow, and shoved. Snow collapsed under both forearms. He heard the dry rip of the cornice giving up. He rolled his shoulder and threw his chest onto solid ground, dragging the dog's front quarters over the lip with him. The rear legs scrabbled like a swimmer reaching the dock, and then found land. They tumbled together into a drift that swallowed them to the waist and lay there while the wind went on its tireless work. Jack laughed once, a broke-off sound closer to a cough. Ranger's head rested against his chest, heavy and real. The dog's chest shuddered and then steadied. Jack's glove was wet where the bite had pierced through, warm spread in a slow star that the cold immediately tried to erase. He reached and touched the collar tag again to make sure it still said what he thought it said. The letters didn't change. "You're a hard one to kill," he said. The dog's tail moved once under the blankets of snow, not a wag so much as a sentence still here. Jack got his knees under him, hissed, and then got his arms around the dog's chest the way teachers insist support the front, let the back follow. He stood with a grunt and a head rush, then took 2 careful steps toward the flagged trail. The storm thinned for a heartbeat, the horizon a torn shade, and in that gap He saw the long white run of the training grounds, the orange glint of a far marker, the singular comfort of a line that led home. He felt the tremor go out of Ranger's body when he began to walk. The dog's weight was honest, the kind that says it needs you and gives you purpose at the same time. Jack moved steady, not fast. He listened to the rope tail dragging to the dog's breath near his ear, to the steady complaint of the mountain. He thought of Lily, 10 years old and fearless in a way that scared him sometimes, the way she used to put her palm on the family Labrador's chest and tell Jack she could feel the dog's heartbeat talk. He thought of a handler named Ortega, who'd once told him that some dogs are born already knowing your name. He did not think about the report that had said presumed KIA, or about the way certain signatures can make truth behave. Those would come later. At the training shed, he kicked the door with his heel and shouldered through the tough plastic flap meant to keep heat where heat belonged. The generator hummed its tireless lullaby under the bench. The space smelled like canvas oil and dog. He laid Ranger on a wool blanket, clicked the propane heater up a notch, and peeled off the chewed glove. The punctures in his palm beaded with small red suns that looked bright against the cold, bleached skin. He cleaned them with iodine and didn't flinch. The sting felt honest, too. Ranger watched with those old soul eyes, ears flicking at each sound like he was cataloging a world he'd been forced to leave too fast. Jack set a bowl of water down, then a second with a few cubes of frozen broth he kept for winter runs. He sat back on his heels and waited. The dog lifted his head, sniffed the steam, and drank in slow, careful licks. When he finished, he put his head down on his paws and looked at Jack with a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. Jack reached over, open palm up, and left his hand where a dog could choose to ignore it. Ranger inched forward and set his muzzle against it for 3 breaths, just long enough to turn a fact into a promise. Outside, the storm's voice deepened and the world bowed to the weather. Jack heard the radio pop with a voice he knew from range control last call, last check. He keyed the mic. "Miller here, RTB in 10. He didn't add what his heart said, not alone. He glanced at the collar tag again as if it might change. It didn't. He said the name once, quietly, because some names deserve to be said like prayers. Ranger. The dog's ear tipped. A long time ago, 2 lives had split on an unseen seam at the corner of a bombed street. On this mountain, in the white breath of winter, they stitched back together by inches. Jack pulled an emergency blanket over the dog and stood to kill the heater before the air went thick. He took one last look at the rope coil by the door and the chalked diagram of a cliff face on the wall where he taught kids about angles and anchors. Tomorrow he would have to ask questions that might not want answers. Tonight, he had rescued a partner he thought the desert had kept. The snow tapped the tin roof in soft fingers. Ranger slept. Jack stepped out into the storm to lock the shed and let the wind push the last of the day off his shoulders. He looked toward the ridge where a dark cut marked the place the mountain had tried to take who it wanted and failed. He touched his bitten hand to his chest to feel the steady measure there, and walked back inside to sit just close enough that the dog would know he was not alone. The wind had finally calmed by dawn, leaving the valley glazed in hard frost and silence that felt almost holy. Staff Sergeant Jack Miller stood outside the field medic station at the base of the mountain, his gloves stiff with frozen blood and his body trembling from exhaustion more than cold. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed and painted everything, the same sterile shade of pale green that made every injury look worse. Ranger lay on a steel table wrapped in 2 wool blankets, his fur matted with melted snow and blood that had turned rusty in the artificial light. His chest rose unevenly, and the sound of each breath scraped like sandpaper against metal. A young medic named Jenkins was trying to hold a vein open for the IV, while Captain Laura Bennett, the station's chief medical officer, prepped a syringe with a calmness that made Jack uneasy. Bennett had served long enough to see when an animal crossed the thin line between survival and mercy. "He's in shock," she said quietly. We can ease him, but you need to understand what that means. Jack's throat felt raw from the cold air and the climb, but he found his voice. Ease him, how Bennett didn't look up. Pentobarbital. Quick, painless. It's the humane choice. Jenkins stopped adjusting the IV line long enough to glance at Jack. Sir, his pulse is fading. We can't stabilize him without sedation anyway. Jack stepped forward close enough to feel the faint heat rising from Ranger's side. No, he said simply. He's breathing. That's all I need to know. Bennett's eyes softened but remained firm. Sergeant, look at him. That leg's torn to muscle. He's hypothermic, his organs are shutting down. This isn't a battlefield. There's no mission to finish. Let him go with dignity. Jack didn't answer. He pulled the glove from his injured hand, revealing puncture marks still raw from the night before, the kind that throbbed with every heartbeat. He placed that same hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the shallow pulse beneath thick fur. He's not done, he whispered. He just needs time. Bennett sighed, set the syringe on the tray, and turned toward the cabinet. Then we try fluids and heat, but you'd better be ready for the outcome. Ranger stirred suddenly, a low, guttural sound rumbling through his chest. Jenkins stepped back, startled. He's waking up, sir. You might want to move. But Jack didn't. He knew that sound. It was not a growl of threat, but of confusion, a reflex born from fear and pain. The dog's front paws twitched as if fighting invisible enemies, the same way Marines moved in their sleep after a firefight. Ranger's eyes snapped open, amber and wild. His jaws clamped down before anyone could react, catching Jack's forearm just above the wrist. Pain flared, sharp and white, but Jack didn't pull away. The room froze in collective breath. Jenkins reached for a tranquilizer, but Jack barked, "Don't." The command came not as anger, but as instinct, the way one speaks to stop an avalanche. He's scared, not violent. Bennett hesitated, syringe halfway raised. "Sergeant, he's going to tear into you." Jack's voice dropped to a tone that cut through the tension like a blade wrapped in cloth. "No, he won't." He leaned closer until Ranger's trembling eased slightly. "It's me, buddy. You're safe. Nobody's leaving you again." The words carried a weight deeper than comfort. They were a promise forged from guilt he hadn't yet spoken aloud. After a few heartbeats, Ranger's jaws loosened. The teeth slipped from Jack's sleeve, leaving blood and torn fabric, but no more pressure. The dog collapsed back onto the blanket, panting, his entire body shaking. Jenkins exhaled audibly, still holding the IV tubing like a lifeline. Bennett lowered the syringe and gave a single nod. "He knows you," she said quietly. "That's something." Jack flexed his fingers to make sure they still worked, then wiped the blood on his pants without looking at it. "Let's get that leg cleaned. I'll hold him." For the next hour, the room filled with the disciplined chaos of field medicine gauze, saline, antiseptic, the click of scissors through matted fur. Ranger endured most of it in exhausted silence, occasionally twitching or lifting his head to follow Jack's voice. Bennett found the wound deep but clean, no shattered bone, no embedded metal. When she shaved the fur back for stitching, she paused, her brow furrowing. "There's scarring here," she said, tracing a pale crescent just above the hock. "Old injury. Years old. Shrapnel pattern." Jack looked closer. The mark was unmistakable, a jagged line puckered like melted wax. He'd seen it before on a dusty road in northern Syria, where an IED had taken Ortega's life and scattered everything that wasn't bolted to the earth. That same blast had supposedly killed Ranger, too. Jack felt the room tilt, the years collapsing in on themselves. That scar, he said, voice barely audible, came from the Bravo 9 explosion. Bennett frowned, glancing up. "That was a training accident, wasn't it?" Jack shook his head slowly. "No, that was a live strike. The report said otherwise." He swallowed the memory, settling heavy behind his ribs. Ranger was there. He took shrapnel to the leg, saved Ortega before the second blast. They wrote it off to protect someone high up. Jenkins looked between them, confusion in his eyes. "Sir, you're saying the file's wrong." "I'm saying it was changed," Jack replied, eyes still on the scar. "And whoever signed off on it wanted this dog forgotten." Bennett tied off the final suture and covered the wound. "Well, he didn't stay forgotten," she said softly. "He came back to you." Jack didn't answer. He was staring at Ranger's face, watching the flicker of awareness behind those amber eyes, as if trying to measure what the dog might remember. The thought unsettled him, the idea that Ranger carried the same ghosts he did unspoken but ever present. When the IV bag was nearly empty, Bennett removed the needle and wrapped Ranger's leg in fresh bandage. "He'll live through the day," she said. "After that, we'll see. But he's going to need rest, warmth, and antibiotics every 6 hours. And if he goes into distress again—" She let the sentence fade. Jack finished it quietly. "Then we'll cross that bridge together." Bennett handed him a clipboard with a waiver. "You're responsible for him now, Sergeant. He's officially off the duty roster." Jack signed without hesitation. As he wrote his name, the letters wavered slightly from fatigue, but the act steadied him. Ranger shifted on the table, eyes half open, the tension leaving his body inch by inch. Jack draped another blanket over him and adjusted the small heater to blow across the table. Outside, sunlight broke through thin cloud, lighting the frost fields until they looked like ground glass. Bennett stepped back to the sink to clean her tools and said without turning, "You should rest too. You look like you fought the whole mountain." Jack managed a faint smile. "I did." He fought harder. He stayed beside Ranger as the medics left one by one, the room settling into a rhythmic quiet, filled only by the soft beep of the monitor. He replayed the image of that scar in his mind, every detail matching the night he'd tried to forget. He remembered the report Hayes had handed him with an expression that allowed no questions. Accidental detonation, it had read no enemy contact. Yet the angles, the shrapnel direction, the missing pieces had always whispered otherwise. Now, with that crescent mark on Ranger's leg, the whispers became proof. He brushed a hand over the dog's head. "You kept a secret too, didn't you?" Ranger's ears twitched in sleep as if acknowledging something unspoken. The clock above the door marked each second like a slow march. Jack leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally catching him, but even as his eyes closed, his mind worked. Someone had buried the truth. Someone high enough to rewrite a battlefield into a paperwork accident. And now that same someone commanded his unit. The discovery didn't yet feel like anger, only clarity, the kind that arrives quietly like dawn over cold stone. He looked once more at Ranger before the weight of sleeplessness pulled him under. "You rest," he murmured. "We've got things to fix." Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing snow from the trees like the breath of a memory refusing to settle. The drive back to Camp Pendleton stretched through the desert like a sentence Jack Miller wasn't ready to finish. The medical convoy hummed over frost-burned asphalt, the rhythmic thrum of tires mixing with the steady beep of the portable monitor strapped beside Ranger's crate. The dog slept under sedation, his chest moving in shallow but even breaths. Jack sat beside him, his bandaged hand resting on the crate's edge, as if proximity alone could anchor what he'd just learned. The scar on Ranger's leg had rewritten everything Jack believed about that mission in Syria. It was no longer a tragedy of circumstance. It was a wound covered by paperwork and command signatures. When the gates of Pendleton appeared against the pale morning light, Jack felt a knot tighten in his chest. The base stood orderly and in different rows of barracks, trimmed grass and flags snapping against the wind. Discipline radiated from every wall, a place where questions were filed away as efficiently as reports. Inside the kennel division, Captain Reynolds met him with clipped precision. "Miller, bring the animal in. Command wants status." Jack wheeled the crate into the inspection bay where fluorescent lights hummed over stainless tables and the sharp scent of disinfectant erased any trace of wilderness. Reynolds checked his clipboard. This is K9 Ranger serial code 4B72, presumed KIA 6 months ago, now suddenly resurrected. How did that happen? Jack replied evenly. Found him during mountain rescue training, injured but alive. Reynolds raised a brow. That must be one for the record books. He scribbled notes before continuing. Commands reviewed his file. They've deemed the animal unfit for return to active service. Too unstable. Protocol requires humane termination. The words landed without inflection, a bureaucratic execution. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Sir, with respect, he's recovering. The medics say he can walk again in weeks. Reynolds set down the clipboard. Orders aren't emotional, Sergeant. They're factual. Ranger's combat data ended 6 months ago. We can't justify resources for a broken asset. Jack's jaw tightened. The phrase broken asset felt like sand in his teeth. He forced his voice steady. He's not a number. He's a Marine. Reynolds sighed, weariness replacing sharpness. You know the rules, Jack. The animal's yours until disposal is authorized. The command center will expect documentation by Friday. He paused before adding in a lower tone, You've got heart, but heart doesn't outrank chain of command. The meeting ended with the finality of a closing door. Jack walked out, carrying the crate's handle, each step echoing through the sterile hall. Ranger stirred once inside, whimpering softly as if sensing the tension vibrating through the metal bars. Jack whispered, Easy, buddy. I'm not letting them end you. That night he sat alone in his quarters. The lights low, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and coffee gone cold. The bass outside settled into the steady rhythm of routine boots on pavement, distant cadence calls, the faint hum of generators. On his desk lay the report Reynolds had handed him, stamped with the red header disposal order. Subject K9 Ranger. Each line was precise, soulless, and irreversible. Yet something inside Jack refused to yield. He thought of the night on the cliff, the weight of the rope, the tremor in the dog's breath, the moment the world chose survival. That wasn't instability. It was proof of will. He turned the page over and began to draft a new report. The heading read, Specialized K9 Rescue Training Sample Request. In the details, he described a hypothetical program for studying animal endurance in high-risk mountain rescues. It wasn't entirely false. Pendleton had proposed similar field studies years ago, but none had gone beyond paperwork. He filled every box with careful precision, each word chosen to sound both official and dull. When he finished, he signed his name and dated it. Then he added one final note at the bottom. Specimen will remain under direct supervision for rehabilitation purposes. By morning, he carried the folder to administration. The clerk at the front desk. Corporal Dean looked up from his monitor. More forms. Sergeant Jack forced a small smile. Just keeping the bureaucracy happy. Dean chuckled and stamped the document without reading the fine print. You know the saying, if it's on paper, it's real. Jack nodded, thinking how true that had become in every sense. 2 hours later, he wheeled Ranger's crate toward the vehicle bay under the guise of transferring training equipment. The guard at the checkpoint scanned the manifest, yawned, and waved him through. No alarms, no suspicion. He drove to the far edge of the base where low housing units sat against the canyon wall. The small duplex he occupied had a back shed once used for supply storage. It smelled of cedar and dust, perfect for hiding something precious. Jack lifted Ranger gently onto a padded cot, the dog groaning faintly but not waking. He arranged heating pads around him, then sat on a wooden stool watching each rise and fall of Ranger's chest. The guilt from forging paperwork pressed at him, but the alternative pressed harder. He whispered, "You've earned more than a line in a report." The following days moved quietly. Jack kept Ranger hidden, tending his wounds between shifts and feeding him warmed rations from the mess hall. Each evening, when drills ended and the barracks went dark, Jack read through old mission logs, cross-referencing GPS data with his own memory. The discrepancies were everywhere. Timestamps off by minutes, coordinates altered by degrees, all aligning with the scar on Ranger's leg. The realization grew heavier with every page someone had rewritten history. One night, as he adjusted the bandage on Ranger's hind leg, the dog opened his eyes. Recognition flickered there, faint but clear. He tried to lift his head and failed, resting instead against Jack's palm. Jack smiled quietly. "That's it. You're still in the fight." The heater clicked softly, filling the shed with a steady hum. Outside, rain began to fall rare for Southern California, tapping the roof in a rhythm that matched Ranger's breathing. For the first time since Syria, Jack felt the strange calm that comes after choosing a side. The risk was enormous. If anyone discovered what he'd done, he could face court-martial. Yet when he thought about orders, he heard Reynolds' voice calling Ranger a broken asset, and he knew he'd already made peace with disobedience. Early Friday morning, before the report's deadline, Jack received a message on his secure terminal. Command review scheduled. Disposal authorization pending, 0900 hours. The words burned on the screen like a clock counting down. He deleted the message and looked toward the shed. Ranger was awake, sitting up for the first time, eyes alert and steady. "Guess we're out of time," Jack murmured. The dog tilted his head as if understanding the gravity of that tone. Jack stood, adjusted his uniform collar, and prepared to face whatever came next. Outside, the sky over Pendleton was washed with pale blue and thin clouds, a deceptive calm before confrontation. The morning sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Jack Miller's small housing unit at Camp Pendleton, casting stripes of gold across the room where he had spent the last few nights balancing secrecy with duty. Ranger slept in the shed behind the house, his breathing steady, now his fur clean, and his wounds healing. Jack had begun to think of the shed as a fragile sanctuary suspended between two worlds, the rigid order of the Marine Corps and the quiet defiance of compassion. That illusion of balance faltered when the base gate guard called mid-morning to inform him that his daughter Emily had arrived for her weekend visit earlier than expected. She was only 10, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already learned what absence felt like. Her mother lived 3 states away, and Pendleton weekends were the small islands of normalcy they both clung to. Jack met her at the gate, trying to mask the tension behind his smile. She ran into his arms, her backpack bouncing her laughter, piercing through the hum of idling trucks and distant cadence calls. "You look tired, Dad," she said, studying his face with disarming honesty. "Big week?" he replied, ruffling her hair. "Ready for pancakes?" She nodded eagerly, unaware that her visit would soon collide with the secret Jack had been hiding. After breakfast, Emily explored the house the way she always did, curiously, methodically, as if mapping her father's life one object at a time. She paused by the shelf where framed photos lined the wall. Her gaze lingered on one in particular, a dusty picture of Jack's unit in Syria, 7 Marines kneeling in front of a Humvee Desert Sun behind them, and at the center a black and tan canine with intelligent eyes and a white scar cutting across its hind leg. "That's him," Emily said softly. "That's the dog I pray for." Jack froze mid-step, his coffee cup half raised. "What do you mean?" She looked up, her small hands gripping the frame carefully. "You showed me this photo last year. You told me his name was Shadow. You said he saved your unit once. I remember his eyes. I always pray he's safe." The name hit Jack like a forgotten echo. Shadow. That was Ranger's original call sign before the files renamed him for classification. He swallowed hard, his mind spinning between disbelief and recognition. Emily traced the dog's face on the glass. "You said he was brave, but Mom told me he didn't make it home." Jack set his cup down carefully, the ceramic clinking against the counter louder than it should have. "Sometimes things aren't what the reports say, sweetheart." She tilted her head. You sound like you're keeping a secret." Her tone was innocent, not accusing, but Jack felt the weight of every unsaid word pressing against his chest. Before he could respond, a soft whimper drifted through the slightly open back window. Emily's head turned instantly. "Dad, was that a dog?" Jack hesitated, but lying to her felt impossible. "Maybe." She blinked. "You have a dog now." "It's complicated. Complicated like when you say you're not mad, but your face gets tight." Jack sighed, smiling faintly despite the tension. "Something like that." Before he could stop her, Emily slipped on her sneakers and trotted toward the back door. "Emily, wait." But she was already outside, sunlight spilling over her red hoodie as she followed the faint sound toward the shed. Jack followed quickly, his pulse quickening. He found her standing at the threshold, peering through the half-open door. Inside, Ranger lifted his head. Ears pricked, golden eyes narrowing in wary alertness. His body tensed, muscles rigid beneath still healing scars. "It's okay," Jack said softly, stepping beside his daughter. "He won't hurt you. He's just scared." But Emily didn't flinch. She studied the dog quietly, her eyes filled with something older than her years. "Shadow," she whispered. The dog's ears twitched. She said it again, clearer this time, voice steady and soft. "Shadow, it's okay." Ranger or Shadow stared at her for a long moment that felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Then, as if the word had unlocked something buried deep in his memory, his whole body began to tremble. Jack instinctively stepped forward, ready to pull Emily back, but she raised one small hand. "It's okay, Dad." Her tone wasn't defiant. It was gentle, certain. Shadow lowered his head, a soft sound escaping him, half whimper, half sigh. His legs gave slightly, and then, for the first time since the cliff, he lay down completely, his chin resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. Emily knelt slowly until she was level with him. "You remember me, don't you?" she murmured. "Not really me, but the prayer, maybe." "I always asked for you to come home safe." Jack's throat tightened. He watched as his daughter extended a trembling hand, palm down, fingers curled slightly, exactly the way handlers approached wary canines. Jack hadn't taught her that. She must have just known. Shadow sniffed her hand, his breath shallow and uneven. Then, in a motion so small it could have been missed, he pressed his muzzle against her fingers. Emily smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "See, Dad? He's good." Jack couldn't speak. He knelt beside her, his hand joining hers on the dog's fur. It was coarse, warm, and alive. Shadow shuddered once, then relaxed fully, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. "How did you know to call him that?" Jack asked quietly. Emily shrugged. "That's his name." It felt wrong to call him anything else. Jack stared at the animal realization dawning that Emily's instinct had reached something his logic couldn't. Maybe trust wasn't rebuilt through control, but through recognition, through someone simply seeing who you really were. As the afternoon light shifted, Emily stayed by Shadow's side, humming softly while Jack cleaned the shed and replaced the bandages. Shadow's eyes followed her every movement, calm but alert, as if he'd appointed himself her guardian already. Later, when Jack tucked her into bed, she asked, "Dad, are you going to keep him?" He hesitated before answering. "I'm going to try." "Then you'll need to tell the truth soon," she said sleepily. "Secrets make people lonely." Her words pierced deeper than she knew. Jack sat in the dark after she fell asleep, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing mixed with the faint scrape of Shadow's claws against the wooden floor outside. The bass was quiet, the kind of stillness that made every thought louder. He realized that Emily hadn't just recognized the dog. She'd recognized something in him, the same tired look, the same instinct to protect even when the rules said otherwise. When dawn came, Jack stood by the window watching the first light catch the edge of the shed. Inside, Shadow lifted his head as if sensing the change in the air. Emily's presence had done what medicine and orders couldn't. She'd given the dog a reason to trust again. After Emily left Camp Pendleton on Sunday afternoon, the silence in Jack Miller's quarters felt heavier than usual. The sound of her laughter still lingered in the corners of the house, but without it, the quiet pressed close as if reminding him of the things he'd buried under years of discipline and orders. Shadow slept beside the back door, the faint rise and fall of his chest visible through the window. Jack sat at his desk with the photograph Emily had found, the one from Syria, and next to it lay a stack of files he wasn't supposed to have. He had accessed them through a secure Marine database earlier that day, using an authorization code he still knew from his logistics assignment years ago. Officially, the records were sealed. Unofficially, Jack needed to know why that mission had ended in so much silence. The cursor blinked on his laptop screen like a heartbeat. The mission report read, Operation Sand Veil Equipment Malfunction During Night Patrol. Casualties 2. KIA-1 K9 lost. Jack scrolled past the redacted lines, the clipped military phrasing, the sentences that said nothing. But then he found a subfile labeled GPS Telemetry K9-274A. That was Shadow's ID. He downloaded it, cross-referencing it with archived coordinates from the operation. The screen filled with a map of the Syrian desert, a cluster of dots marking movement. The last recorded position of K9-274A stopped roughly 100 yards east of the blast site. Jack frowned. The report had claimed the dog was caught in the same explosion that killed Corporal Hayes and Sergeant Rivera. Yet according to this data, Shadow had already moved away, running toward the unit from a scouting position. His path formed a distinct pattern approach. Pause, turn back, and then nothing. The signal ended abruptly, not faded. Terminated. Jack leaned back, staring at the map. A chill crawled through him. Shadow hadn't died in the blast. He had run back to warn them. Someone had shut off his transmitter before the explosion. He printed the map, his hands trembling slightly. The hum of the base outside felt distant, almost foreign. If Shadow's signal had been cut, it wasn't an accident. Someone had made that decision. Jack pulled the rest of the file, combing through lines of maintenance reports and equipment checklists. Buried near the end was an authorization code for the transmitter shutdown. It was signed and approved by a single officer, Major Thomas Keene. Jack stared at the name for a long time, the letters sharp and cold on the page. Major Keene was now his commanding officer at Pendleton, the same man who had shaken his hand 2 weeks ago, commending him for exemplary dedication. The same man who had ordered him to report all recovered military assets, including retired K9s. And the same man who had once said almost casually, "Some losses. Sergeant are just the cost of doing business." The air in the room seemed to thin. Jack could hear his pulse in his ears. He turned off the laptop, closed the blinds, and sat in the dim light of his desk lamp. The dog stirred outside, letting out a soft whine. "It wasn't your fault," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "You tried to save us." The memory hit him hard. The explosion. The sandstorm of debris. Hayes shouting over the radio. The flash that stole half a second and half his team. He remembered hearing Shadow's bark seconds before the blast, urgent, panicked, trying to drag Hayes away. The pieces connected like shards of glass. Shadow had done everything right. The system had failed him. Or rather, someone had chosen to silence him. Jack's jaw clenched. He went to the shed where Shadow lay curled up, the dog's eyes half open. The scar on his hind leg caught the lamplight. Jack knelt and traced it gently. "You carried that warning all the way through fire, didn't you?" The dog looked at him, unblinking, a faint tremor running through his body. "We were told it was an accident," Jack said softly. "They told us you ran the wrong way. They lied." Shadow exhaled heavily, lowering his head onto Jack's knee. For a long time, neither moved. The base intercom echoed faintly outside, announcing curfew. Jack returned to the house and began writing. He documented every coordinate, every discrepancy, every name. He needed proof before confronting anyone. He sent an encrypted message to an old friend in intelligence requesting access to archived satellite data from that night. Within hours, a reply came through. "Jack, don't dig. You won't like what you find." But he was past that point. The truth had already started to thaw. By midnight, the heater clicked off, leaving the house in brittle silence. Jack heard footsteps in the hallway outside his quarters, measured deliberate military. He checked the peephole. No one. When he opened the door, a folded envelope sat on the floor. Inside, one sentence written in neat black ink. "Stop asking about Operation Sand Veil." No signature, no insignia, just the unspoken warning of someone who knew he had already crossed a line. Jack looked up at the night sky through the narrow window. Clouds were gathering over the ocean, heavy and cold. He realized he had stumbled into something larger than negligence, something built on deliberate silence. He closed the envelope and locked it in the drawer beside his service pistol. When he looked back outside, Shadow was sitting by the door, head tilted as if sensing the shift in his handler's heartbeat. "It's okay, boy," Jack said quietly, though his voice betrayed the lie. "We're fine." But both of them knew better. The next morning, Jack reported for duty as if nothing had changed. Major Keene greeted him in the corridor with that practiced warmth that came from years of command. "Miller, how's the dog situation?" "Under control, sir," Jack answered evenly. "Good," Keene said, clapping his shoulder. "We don't want any surprises, do we?" His tone was light, but his eyes held something colder, something that told Jack the envelope on his doorstep hadn't been the only message. That night, Jack sat by the shed again. The map spread across the workbench, the coordinates glimmering under the lamplight like buried truths finally surfacing. Shadow lay at his feet, his breathing steady but restless ears flicking at every sound. "They left you there," Jack murmured. "And they expect me to do the same now." Shadow lifted his head, and in his eyes Jack saw not fear, but something deeper expectation, trust, the faint reflection of the Marine he used to be. "Not this time," he said, closing the file. The air outside had turned colder, the first frost forming on the grass. Beneath it, the ground held secrets older than paperwork, older than orders. Somewhere under the weight of that frost, the truth waited patient, as a dog that refused to stop searching. The wind over the Sierra Nevada peaks that morning screamed like something alive, its voice sharp enough to cut through layers of snow and steel. By noon, the blizzard had turned the training base into a white void, where outlines blurred and orders echoed without direction. Sergeant Jack Miller stood by the open hangar, his parka stiff with frost, watching the rescue helicopter idle in the distance. The emergency call had come in less than an hour ago. A convoy of young Marines on mountain survival training had been caught in an avalanche near Bear Ridge. Communications were down. Temperatures were dropping fast. Command was deploying every available K-9 unit for search and rescue. Jack had no official reason to go. His unit was scheduled for base maintenance duty, not rescue operations. But when he overheard the distress report, something in him stirred a pull he couldn't ignore. In the back of his mind, he heard Emily's voice. Secrets make people lonely. He looked toward the shed where Shadow waited, restless. The dog sensed the storm before anyone else, pacing by the door, ears pricked toward the sound of distant thunder. Jack crouched beside him. "You shouldn't be out there," he said quietly. "You're not fully healed." Shadow's golden eyes lifted to his, calm yet insistent. It wasn't obedience that passed between them now. It was understanding. Jack hesitated only a moment before reaching for the harness. "All right," he murmured. "One more mission together." They boarded the last transport truck heading toward the ridge. The climb was slow, the tires fighting for traction on ice. Snow whipped sideways in relentless sheets, erasing the road until it felt like they were driving into nothing. The radio crackled fragments of updates Unit Bravo. No signal. Approaching ridge. Multiple injuries. Jack sat near the rear shadow beside him, muzzle-lifted nostrils flaring as if he could smell the trapped men through the storm. When the truck finally stopped, visibility was near zero. The rescue teams spread out in pairs, roped together, probing through the snow. Jack adjusted his goggles, clipped his harness, and looked at Shadow. "You remember this terrain," he said, though he wasn't sure if the dog could hear him over the wind. "Different mountain, same fight." Shadow lowered his head and started forward without waiting for a command. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind carving strange shapes out of the drifts. Jack followed closely, watching the dog's movements. Even limping slightly, Shadow moved with uncanny purpose, pausing, sniffing, adjusting direction. When the first faint human scent reached him, he stopped, barked once, and lunged toward the ridge. "Hold!" Jack shouted, trying to keep pace. "Slow down." But Shadow was already climbing the incline, his dark body a ghost against the white. Jack cursed under his breath and followed. The ridge narrowed, the snow crust cracking beneath each step. Through the blinding white, Jack glimpsed a torn tent half buried under ice. He dropped to his knees, brushed away snow, and saw the edge of a backpack strap. He shouted for the medics. As the others moved in, Shadow kept going past the tent toward the upper slope. "Shadow, stop." Jack called again, but the dog's ears were pinned forward, his instincts locked on something unseen. The wind howled harder, carrying the sound of breaking ice. Jack's stomach dropped. "Shadow." He sprinted after him. The dog reached a ledge, barking into the wind, and Jack realized with horror what he'd found: a crevasse wide and deep where part of the slope had collapsed. The tracks led dangerously close to the edge, too close. Back, Jack shouted, extending his arm. "Shadow, heal." But before the command finished leaving his lips, the snow beneath them shifted with a low groan. The world tilted. The ledge gave way. The next instant was a blur of motion, ice, air, and the sudden absence of ground. Jack's body slammed against something hard, his rope snapping taut. He dangled over a jagged drop, the cold slicing through his uniform. Snow cascaded past his face like shards of glass. He looked down. Shadow hung below him, caught in the secondary harness line, claws scrabbling at the icy wall. "Hold on!" Jack shouted, his breath clouding in the air. The dog twisted, trying to find purchase, his claws scraping but finding nothing. The harness creaked ominously. Jack braced his boots against the frozen wall and hauled on the rope. The carabiner groaned under the weight of both of them. Above, a figure appeared at the edge, one of the rescue Marines, but the wind tore his voice away. Jack couldn't wait. He started climbing one-handed, pulling himself up, inch by inch, using the rope anchored to his chest rig. The snow was slick with meltwater, the air burning his lungs. He could feel Shadow's weight dragging against him, every movement sending a bolt of pain through his shoulder. Almost there, he panted. The wind screamed again, and a sheet of ice cracked above them, raining shards that stung his face. Shadow barked once sharp, urgent, then lunged upward, trying to climb the rope with him. The sudden shift of weight nearly pulled them both loose. Jack wrapped his arm tighter, gritting his teeth. "Easy, Shadow. Easy." The dog stopped thrashing. Instead, he pressed his body close to the ice wall, using his front paws to brace Jack's footing. It wasn't enough to lift them, but it stabilized him, a silent coordination born of shared instinct. Jack pulled again, each movement a battle. Minutes felt like hours. His muscles burned. The rope above him began to fray, one strand at a time. "Don't you dare," he whispered. Not again. He could see the ledge now, a dark outline through the snow. With one final surge, he hooked his elbow over the edge, pushing with everything left in him. The world narrowed to breath rope and the weight of the animal depending on him. He dragged Shadow up beside him just as the frayed section snapped and whipped down into the abyss. They tumbled onto solid ground, gasping. The world around them was a white blur of motionless wind and endless noise. Jack rolled onto his back, pulling Shadow against him, his chest heaving. "You saved me," he murmured. The dog's body trembled, his fur rimed with frost. He buried his head under Jack's arm, shivering violently. Rescue teams appeared minutes later, their shouts faint under the roar of the storm. Hands pulled them both to safety, but Jack's mind was elsewhere. As he looked at the collapsed ledge, the memory of the Syrian cliff returned with brutal clarity. Another fall, another near death, another moment when the world had decided who lived and who didn't. Only this time, he hadn't lost the dog. As the medics wrapped them in thermal blankets, Shadow lifted his head weakly and pressed his nose against Jack's wrist. His pulse steadied beneath the touch. Somewhere above the storm, the sun struggled to break through, scattering thin bands of light across the frozen ridge. It was faint, but it was there a promise of something waiting beyond survival. The storm had not stopped. It had simply changed its rhythm, becoming slower, deeper, heavier, like a tired beast still unwilling to die. The ridge was an open wound carved by wind and ice, and the rescue line that held Sergeant Jack Miller and Shadow now looked far too thin against the white expanse of the cliff. Above them, silhouettes of Marines appeared as dark smudges through the swirling snow, shouting orders that the wind immediately stole. The rope connecting Jack to the surface stretched tight, creaking in protest. Shadow pressed close against his chest, his body trembling violently, claws scraping the ice as they fought to hold their position on a narrow shelf no wider than 2 boots. Jack knew the shelf wouldn't last. The cracking beneath their weight had turned from occasional to constant. He tried to move higher, digging in with his crampons, but the ice shattered under every kick. He looked up, his eyes burning from snow glare, and saw the rope strand above him beginning to fray. Each fiber snapped with a faint sound that only he and the storm could hear. "They can't reach us," he muttered to Shadow, who looked up at him with steady, unflinching eyes. "But we're not giving them a body count today." He reached for his knife, clipped to his vest, and in one practiced motion cut his secondary line to free it from the tangle below. The movement caused the main rope to jerk violently, and the shelf groaned louder. He knew they were running out of time. The rescue team above was throwing down another line, but it swung uselessly in the wind, slapping against the rock face before falling away. Jack keyed his radio. "Echo 2. This is Miller. The line's compromised. We're hanging on a fracture. If it goes, it's both of us." Static replied, then a broken voice. "Copy. Hold position. Rope team inbound." But Jack knew they would never make it in time. The mountain had its own timetable. He looked down at Shadow, who was bleeding again from one of his hind legs. The bandage had torn in the fall, the blood freezing in thin streaks on his fur. Jack's chest tightened. "You did your part, buddy," he whispered. "Now you listen to me." He unclipped the harness connecting Shadow to his own rig and looped the dog's line directly to the rescue cable that dangled closest. He tied the knot himself, fingers stiff from cold but sure from years of training. Then he looked the dog in the eyes and gave the hardest order he had ever spoken. "Climb, boy." Shadow froze his head, tilting as if not understanding. Jack forced the words again, louder this time. "That's an order, climb." He gave the rope a shove upward, hoping instinct would carry the command where words could not. For a heartbeat, the dog hesitated, torn between training and something older, deeper. Then Shadow dug his claws into the ice and began to climb. Jack's breath hitched, a mix of pride and heartbreak. The line above tightened as Shadow pulled himself upward, using what strength he had left. The ice shelf beneath Jack began to disintegrate, cracks racing across it like lightning. He looked up again, saw the rope still holding, and smiled faintly. "Good boy," he said under his breath. "You get home." The shelf gave way beneath his left foot, sending a surge of motion through his body. His harness jerked hard, the rope burning against his glove as it slid. For a moment he hung free, suspended in white nothingness. Above him, Shadow stopped climbing. Jack shouted, "Go! That's an order!" But the dog looked down and made a sound that wasn't quite a bark. It was defiance, raw and wild. In a blur of motion, Shadow leaped down, jaws clamping onto the rescue line that held Jack. His weight yanked the rope taut again, preventing it from slipping further. The strain was enormous. Jack felt the pull in his shoulders, the rope cutting into his side. "Shadow, no," he gasped, trying to push the dog upward, but Shadow refused to let go. The dog dug in his paws, anchoring himself against a small ridge of rock, every muscle trembling with effort. The ice groaned beneath them, the wind roaring so loud it felt like the earth was howling. Jack's vision blurred with exhaustion and disbelief. The rope began to rise inch by inch as the rescue team above finally managed to pull. He could feel it now, the combined strength of the men above and the impossible determination of the animal beside him. "You stubborn Marine," Jack murmured through clenched teeth, tears freezing before they could fall. The ridge cracked again. Jack reached up, grabbed a new section of rope, and climbed using every ounce of strength left in his body. The air was razor-thin, each breath shallow and searing. Shadow's movements matched his step-for-step pulling when Jack slipped, pushing when Jack faltered. For a few eternal seconds, man and dog moved as one entity bound not by command, but by survival. When his hand finally found the edge of the cliff, strong arms reached down and grabbed him, hauling him the rest of the way up. Jack collapsed onto the snow, gasping. "Shadow," he shouted, struggling to sit up. A moment later, the dog's head appeared over the edge, hauled by two Marines gripping the harness. Shadow landed beside him, collapsing against his chest. The sound of the helicopter blades overhead blended with the pounding of Jack's heart. He wrapped his arms around the dog, his voice breaking. "You saved me again." The medic knelt beside them, checking vitals. "Both alive," he said in disbelief. "Barely, but alive." The ice shelf below them shattered a second later with a roar that shook the mountain. Jack turned his head just enough to see the void where they had hung minutes before. "We made it," he whispered. Shadow raised his head weakly and licked the back of Jack's glove, his eyes half closed but bright. Around them, the rescue team worked quickly, securing lines, loading the injured. The storm was breaking patches of blue sky emerging through the clouds. As they were lifted toward the waiting helicopter, Jack looked down at the ridge below where shards of ice sparkled like glass. It struck him that the mountain hadn't been trying to kill them. It had been testing them, measuring something unseen. He looked at Shadow again, realizing what the test had been. Not strength, not endurance, loyalty. True loyalty, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. As the helicopter rose, Jack placed his hand on Shadow's chest, feeling the faint but steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The dog's eyes met his, and for that moment, no words were needed. 3 weeks after the mountain rescue, Camp Pendleton no longer looked like a place Jack Miller belonged to. The air still carried the clean scent of pine and salt from the Pacific, but everything else felt sharp-edged and distant, as though the base itself were watching him. Word of the incident had spread faster than the storm that nearly killed them. The official report called it a successful retrieval under adverse conditions, but beneath the praise were whispers, questions about why a canine deemed unfit for duty had been in the field at all, why his handler had violated direct command, and why there were missing data files in the operation's transmission logs. The whispers solidified into a summons. United States Marine Corps Court of Inquiry. Subject Staff Sergeant Jack Miller. Charges misuse of classified material, unauthorized canine deployment, destruction of property. It was printed on crisp white paper, stamped in black. Jack read it once without blinking, then folded it neatly and placed it beside Shadow's food bowl. "Looks like it's time to tell the truth," he murmured. The day of the hearing dawned cloudless and pale, the kind of morning that gave no warmth despite the sun. The tribunal chamber sat inside a low, gray building near the airfield, windowless, soundless, unforgiving. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wax and old wood. 3 officers sat behind a raised desk, Colonel Richard Hayes presiding, flanked by 2 other senior officials. At the far side, Captain Reynolds waited as the prosecution witness. Jack's boots clicked on the floor as he entered his uniform, immaculate, his face unreadable. Shadow waited outside under the care of a veterinary officer, his legs still bandaged, but his spirit unmistakably restless. Jack saluted sharply. Staff Sergeant Miller reporting as ordered. Hayes returned the gesture with minimal courtesy. At ease. Let's make this straightforward, Sergeant. You're accused of defying standing orders, falsifying records, and concealing a government asset. Do you dispute these charges? I dispute their accuracy, sir, Jack replied evenly. Not their existence. A murmur rippled through the spectators' benches, mostly Marines who'd served with him or heard of the rescue. Hayes ignored it. We have reports that you removed K-9 Shadow from authorized custody, altered his training classification, and deployed him in an unapproved field mission, resulting in structural damage to government property. Is this correct? Partially, sir, Jack said. I retrieved Shadow from the base facility after command ordered his termination. I reclassified him as a rescue training asset. The deployment in question saved 4 Marines trapped on Bear Ridge. Hayes's jaw tightened, at the cost of insubordination. Jack's gaze didn't waver, at the cost of obedience to a mistake. The room went still. Hayes leaned back, steepling his fingers. You presume to decide which orders are mistakes, Sergeant. No, sir, Jack said softly. But I can tell the difference between a rule and a lie. That sentence hung in the air heavy enough to draw every eye. Hayes frowned. Explain yourself. Jack reached into his folder and placed a small black data chip on the table before the tribunal. This is Shadow's GPS tracker. It records his movement history, including the day of Operation Sand Veil in Syria, the mission listed as a training accident. I recovered the device when he was found alive in Montana. One of the officers picked up the chip, examining it. And what do you claim it shows? Jack's voice remained calm. It shows that Shadow wasn't caught in the explosion. He was running toward the unit to warn them. His transmitter was deactivated manually from command control before detonation. The murmuring rose again, this time sharper. Hayes's expression stayed composed, but a muscle flickered near his jaw. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, Jack said, sliding another item across the table, a compact drive. It's data, along with helmet camera footage from the Bear Ridge rescue. Both devices record the same dog 6 months apart, demonstrating alert and restraint behavior. Not instability, not aggression. Instinct to protect. Hayes gestured for the technician to load the files. The screen behind the tribunal flickered to life, showing the frozen ridge, the blizzard, the rope. Jack's breath quickened as the image stabilized himself, clinging to the cliff, the world dissolving into white. Then came Shadow, jumping down, clamping onto the rescue line, refusing to leave. The silence in the room grew thick. The footage showed no violence, no disobedience, only resolve. The camera captured the moment Shadow braced his body to hold the rope steady, the seconds that stretched between life and death, and the sound, Jack's voice breaking, "You saved me again." When the video ended, the room stayed silent. Even the hum of the projector seemed hesitant to intrude. Hayes cleared his throat, but the sound cracked slightly. You risked your life and your units for an animal you had no right to keep. Jack looked at him. I risked it for a Marine who wasn't finished serving. Hayes glanced toward the side table where Captain Reynolds sat. Captain, you recommended the disposal order. Any comment? Reynolds shifted his voice, uncertain. Based on the file we had, the dog was unstable. I didn't know about the GPS data, sir. Who approved that report? Jack asked quietly. Hayes didn't answer. Reynolds frowned. The authorization came from Central Command, signed under Major Thomas Keene. At the mention of the name, the entire room seemed to exhale. Hayes straightened. Major Keene isn't under review here. He should be, Jack said. He signed the false report that classified a live strike as a training mishap and ordered Shadow left behind. He buried 2 Marines and a dog under paperwork to protect his career. Hayes's lips thinned. You'll need proof. You already have it, Jack replied. The same authorization code that shut off Shadow's transmitter appears on Keene's digital signature in the Sand Vale archive. The second officer confirmed it within minutes, typing on a secure terminal. He's right, she said quietly. It matches. The room shifted, the balance of authority tilting like a deck in heavy seas. Hayes looked pale now, the weight of hierarchy pressing visibly across his shoulders. This tribunal will recommend a formal investigation, he said finally. His tone was careful, bureaucratic, but the damage had been done. Jack nodded once. That's all I wanted, sir. The truth. Hayes looked at him for a long moment before speaking again, softer. And the dog? He stays with me, Jack said simply. He earned that much. Hayes exhaled weary and waved a hand toward the clerk. Proceed with the closing record. The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. The case wasn't officially over, but the verdict had already taken root in every silent pair of eyes in that room. When Jack stepped outside, the sunlight hit him like release. Shadow was waiting near the steps, tail low, but wagging when he saw his handler. Jack knelt and rested his hand on the dog's head. Looks like you testified without saying a word, he said quietly. The wind carried the sound of the ocean across the base clean and wide. The truth was no longer buried, it had broken through the frost. The morning of the ceremony rose with the kind of stillness that only comes after storms, the kind where even the ocean at Camp Pendleton seemed to hold its breath. Rows of Marines stood in full dress uniform across the parade field, the rhythmic sound of flags snapping in the wind echoing across the base. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that made every medal gleam brighter, every salute sharper. Staff Sergeant Jack Miller stood at the edge of the formation, his posture rigid, his heart steady, his mind still half anchored in disbelief. It had been 2 weeks since the tribunal. The investigation into Major Keene had begun quietly but decisively, confirming the data Jack had exposed. For the first time in months, truth had outweighed silence. Yet even now, as the official commendation unfolded before him, Jack felt a strange humility rather than triumph. He hadn't fought for recognition. He'd fought for a life that deserved to be remembered as more than a line in a file. Behind him, near the reviewing stand, Shadow sat perfectly still beside a young handler from the K-9 division, wearing a fresh vest emblazoned with the Marine emblem. The old scars were still visible beneath the fur, but his eyes clear alert. Patient looked more alive than they had in months. When the announcer's voice rose over the loudspeaker, every head turned toward the podium. By order of the United States Marine Corps Command, in recognition of extraordinary courage and devotion beyond duty, the reinstatement of K-9 Operative Designation Number 4B72, Shadow, is hereby confirmed. The crowd shifted, a low murmur rippling like wind through grass. Jack's throat tightened. The announcer continued. For acts of valor that directly resulted in the preservation of human life during the Bear Ridge operation, K-9 Shadow is awarded the commendation for valor beyond duty. The applause began as a soft, hesitant sound, then grew stronger, a wave that rolled across the field. The young handler led Shadow forward toward the stage. The dog's gait was measured, purposeful, almost ceremonial. When they reached the front, the base commander himself bent down, fastening a small bronze medal onto the vest strap. The tag caught the sunlight, flashing once like a signal. The commander stood straight again. "This Marine saved one of ours," he said, simply, his voice carrying through the speakers. not because he was ordered to, but because loyalty is a language older than command. Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. For the first time since Syria, the world seemed balanced again. After the ceremony, the announcer called his name. "Staff Sergeant Jack Miller, please step forward." He obeyed boots, striking the pavement with steady precision. The commander smiled faintly as he handed him a folder. "You've caused quite a ripple, Sergeant," he said. "It's not every day a Marine rewrites protocol." Sir Jack replied quietly, "I wasn't trying to rewrite it, just correct it." The commander nodded. "All the same commands decided you're the right man to lead our next initiative. You'll remain active duty and head a new program, Rescue Under Fire. We'll teach field units how to survive when everything goes wrong. Your Cliff, your choices, your K9, they'll become part of the curriculum." Jack accepted the folder, his hands steady but his voice low. "Thank you, sir. I'll make sure the lessons stick." The commander's expression softened. "They already have." When he turned back toward the ranks, Shadow was sitting exactly where he'd left him. Tail, still eyes locked on Jack as if waiting for a signal. Jack crouched and extended his arm. "Come on, partner," he said softly. Shadow rose and trotted over, pushing his head against Jack's knee. Cameras clicked in the distance, but neither of them moved for a moment. "You've got your badge back," Jack murmured. "About time they realized what you were." The dog exhaled through his nose, the closest thing to a sigh of contentment. A group of new recruits nearby watched in quiet awe. One of them whispered, "That's him, the K9 from the cliff." Jack heard it, but he didn't look up. He scratched behind Shadow's ear and said, "It's never about cliffs. It's about not letting go." Later that afternoon, after the ceremony ended, the base began to dissolve back into motion. Trucks rumbled, orders were shouted, flags lowered. Jack remained on the parade field long after most had gone, staring at the empty podium. In the quiet, the magnitude of it all settled in the long road from that frozen mountain to this sunlit ground. He thought of Emily, how she had said secrets make people lonely. He decided he would call her tonight and tell her everything. She deserved to know how her prayer had reached across oceans and found them both. Shadow nudged his hand as if echoing the thought. "We made it, huh?" Jack said softly. The dog wagged his tail, once deliberate and sure. They walked together toward the kennels where the new recruits were beginning orientation. Captain Reynolds stood waiting near the entrance, clipboard in hand. "Miller," he said, "Command wants you to brief the class in an hour." Jack raised a brow. "First day on the job already?" Reynolds grinned. "You're the reason the course exists. You might as well start it." Jack looked at Shadow. "Think you can handle another crowd, old boy?" Shadow tilted his head tail, flicking once more. "That's a yes," Jack said. Inside the briefing hall, the projector displayed a still image from the rescue footage, the two of them dangling from the cliff rope, taut snow flying. Beneath it were the words, "Rescue Under Fire. Trust is the lifeline." Jack stood in front of the class, the metal gleaming faintly on his chest, Shadow sitting quietly beside him. "Most of you think survival is about strength," he began, "but sometimes it's about something simpler. It's about believing the one next to you won't let go." The recruits listened, their expressions solemn. Shadow glanced up at him, then at the screen, then back again as if recognizing himself. Jack smiled faintly. "When you're hanging between sky and earth, remember this orders can end, but loyalty doesn't." The room was silent for a long moment before the recruits began to clap. It wasn't loud, it was respectful, the kind of applause that meant understanding, not admiration. Afterward, Jack walked outside into the fading light. The sun hung low over the Pacific, turning the sky amber. Shadow trotted ahead, stopping at the edge of the parade field. Jack watched the dog lift his head toward the horizon, ears catching the wind. The moment felt like a bridge between past and present, two survivors bound not by command, but by choice. The morning air carried a softness that only spring could bring. The storms had long passed, leaving the mountains washed clean, their ridges glistening under sunlight that danced like silver across melting snow. Captain Jack Miller adjusted his field cap and surveyed the terrain ahead, the same cliff face that had nearly claimed his life and his K9s months ago. Behind him, a group of fresh recruits stood ready, their uniforms crisp, their eyes bright with that particular blend of eagerness and unease that marked men about to face something real. "All right, listen up," Jack called, his voice steady but calm. "This isn't just about technique. It's about trust between you, your rope, your partner, and the ground under your feet. If one fails, all fail. That's the point of this course." He gestured toward the harnesses, the rappel lines, the gear arrayed neatly like instruments before an orchestra. "You're going to descend 15 meters, reach the midpoint ledge, secure the dummy, and signal for extraction. Remember, communication saves lives, assumptions end them." He gave a brief smile that broke the military hardness in his tone. "And yes, you'll have help from the best lead we've got." At that cue, Shadow stepped forward, wearing his black training vest marked with bold white letters, K9 Rescue Unit. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, the faint scar on his flank barely visible now. The recruits murmured quietly among themselves, some smiling, others nodding in respect. Shadow stood perfectly still beside Jack, eyes sharp, tail level, a soldier in his own right. "He's not here to impress you," Jack said, lowering to one knee beside the dog. "He's here to remind you what loyalty looks like." At the command word, Shadow trotted toward the edge of the ridge, sniffing the air, gauging wind and slope. He stopped, barked once, sharp and sure, then turned as if to say, "All clear." The recruits followed in pairs, descending one by one while Jack observed from the top. Each time the line went taut, each time a boot found purchase on the stone. He watched their faces shift from fear to focus. The echo of their calls bounced off the granite walls. "Rope secure. Moving down. Copy that, steady as you go." The scene mirrored 100 past drills, yet for Jack, this one carried a private weight. The smell of rock and thawing earth brought back the night of the storm, the snow burning against his skin, the sound of the rope straining under Shadow's pull. But now there was sunlight instead of ice, laughter instead of silence, and in place of dread, there was purpose. When the last pair reached the ledge, Jack signaled Shadow. "Show them how it's done, partner." The dog leaped gracefully onto the first anchor paws, gripping stone with uncanny precision. With the custom harness supporting him, he maneuvered down tail, steady for balance, his instincts blending training with memory. On the ledge, the recruits watched in astonishment as the dog secured the mock rescue beacon in his jaws and climbed back with controlled strength. Jack smiled faintly. "That's the difference between training and trust," he said. "One you memorize. The other, you live." The drill ended by midday, the recruits gathering near the vehicles for debrief. Jack stood slightly apart, gazing toward the cliff's edge. The snow had receded, revealing the rock's dark veins beneath the same pattern he had stared at while hanging between sky and ground. Now it shimmered under the sun, streaked with rivulets of meltwater that caught the light like threads of glass. Shadow padded up beside him, following his gaze. "You remember this place?" Jack murmured. "I do too." The dog barked softly as if in answer. "We both fell here," Jack continued quietly, "and somehow we climbed out with more than we lost." He crouched, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. "They'll learn from us, you know. Maybe they'll never hang from a cliff like we did, but they'll know what it means to hold on." One of the recruits, a tall young man with a nervous smile, approached. "Sir, permission to ask something?" Jack nodded. "Go ahead. Why bring us here?" You could have taught this anywhere safer. Jack considered for a moment, then said, because safety doesn't teach courage. Risk does. And because this cliff isn't just rock, it's a reminder. It doesn't care who you are or what rank you wear. It only asks one question, will you trust? The recruit nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Yes, sir. Good, Jack said. That's the lesson. As the group packed up, a breeze rolled through the valley carrying the scent of pine and salt from the distant ocean. The sound of water dripping from the thawing cliff blended with the rhythmic click of carabiners and boots on gravel. Shadow walked to the very edge and looked down the sunlight striking his fur in streaks of silver and gold. He barked once, twice, bright alive, not in warning, but in triumph. Jack watched him, and something inside eased the final knot of guilt and grief untying quietly. That's right, he whispered. It's not a place of loss anymore. He straightened his silhouette tall against the horizon. It's where we begin again. The convoy engines started breaking the quiet. The recruits loaded gear, still talking in low, awed tones about the dog who had led them. Jack gave a last glance toward the cliff before turning to Shadow. Time to go home. Shadow wagged his tail and fell into step beside him, their shadows stretching long across the stone. The mountain behind them glowed pale gold, the same mountain that had once nearly taken everything and now gave it back tenfold. As they walked, Jack thought of Emily waiting at home, of her letters, her drawings of Shadow, of how she'd written, "If you listen hard enough, even the mountains say thank you." Maybe she was right. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but standing on it stronger than before. The sound of boots and paws in rhythm filled the air, steady, certain, alive. At the base of the ridge, Jack looked back one final time. The cliff caught the afternoon light gleaming like steel dipped in mercy. The memory no longer hurt. It simply existed, folded neatly into the story of who they were. He turned forward, hand brushing Shadow's shoulder. Let's move out, partner. Shadow barked once, a sound clear and full of life, echoing down the slope until it blended with the hum of the engines and the laughter of men who had just learned what loyalty truly meant. There was no more cold wind, no more fear, only sunlight and the quiet certainty that some bonds once forged in struggle can never be broken. And that's where their story comes full circle, from a frozen cliff in Wyoming to the sunlight of redemption. Jack and Shadow proved that loyalty isn't a command. It's a choice. Now I want to hear from you. What moment in this story moved you the most? Do you think you could have made the same choices Jack did? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to mention the city or state you're watching from. If this story spoke to you, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one. There's always another story waiting in the quiet corners of America.